My name is Bree Dussault. I am a practitioner in residence at the Center on Reinventing Public Education, or CRPE. I'll be kicking us off, and I'm really excited to be with everyone in this room learning from our three state leaders here as part of this panel. And hoping that you're in the right panel. This is the panel on how strong state leadership can stem the tide of learning loss. And we are two of us here from the Center on Reinventing Public Education, and we're joined by three great leaders from three different states across the country. So I've mentioned who I am, just a real quick introduction of who's in the room, and then we'll dive on in. Ashley Jocham is here. She is a senior research analyst at the Center on Reinventing Public Education, along with me. We've got Kira Orange-Jones. Kira is the District 2 representative for the Louisiana State Board of Elementary and Secondary Education, or BESE. And she's also in her spare time an executive director at Teach for America. We've got Hansel King. She is the assistant dean and executive director of the Broad Center at Yale University. And until very recently, just a month ago, she was the District of Columbia's state superintendent of education. And we've got David Mansouri, who is president and CEO of Tennessee SCORE. So what today is going to look like, I will walk us all through some data and some of the work that CRPE's been doing studying district and state responses to school closures. That'll hopefully take about 10 to 15 minutes tops, and then I will pass it over to Ashley to engage in a discussion with our panelists on their reflections and lessons learned and guidance and advice for us this year. And we'll be opening up any of these portions to your questions. So please use the Q&A or the chat components of this platform to let us know what you're wondering. It's wonderful to see all of you in here. So diving in, let me pull up some slides. I've got a fair number of slides here. I believe that you should be able to download this document if you want to dive deep on them. I'm going to be going kind of high level, just hitting some main points, just to lay a foundation of what we've seen across the country in terms of school, district, and state responses to school closures related to the COVID pandemic. So we at the Center on Reinventing Public Education, this is a portion of something we do called the Evidence Project. It's a center. It's actually a hub for over 100 different national researchers from across the country. And what we're going to be presenting today are some of our takeaways based on research that we've been doing for the past 8 months. And on the whole, I think I'm stating probably what we already know or have experienced, but we know that schools were not expecting to be going into remote learning in March. We know that there were a lot of gaps in what instruction looked like last spring as different systems worked to set up supports to families and students. Summer, there were some, we'll look at the data on this, there was some foray into summer school. And districts did try to build off these learnings to shore up stronger learning platforms and programs for students this fall. And there's a lot, a question still of what things look like. And we've got some initial data from this fall that we'll share at the very end that's just coming out of our latest round of analysis. In terms of what we've done at CRPE, starting in the week of March 16, so when schools closed, we began tracking districts on about a weekly basis. So we've been watching about 100 districts every week and tracking their behaviors, their decisions, and what they've been prioritizing for the last 8 months. That actually is this green section we call our urban districts. Those districts range from 82 to 106 based on which time of year it was. And they're probably the districts They're big districts, and there is at least one district from every state. And some states have many represented. We also have a database that we call our national sample, which is a representative sample. And that is going to tell us it's a much bigger sample of districts, and they are representative of the districts across the country. And so to present this information to you today, we've got charts in blue represent a national sample, and just know that means that is more predictive or representative of the country. And then we've got charts in green, which is our urban district database, which is more about day-to-day or week-to-week decisions that districts are making, because we did update that database, as I said, every week since March. So that's just setting up the frame. And now I'm excited to just walk folks through some of the data that we've seen. So in terms of learning plans, I would point folks to look at this far right column around, these are districts who offered curriculum, instruction, and progress monitoring while remote in the spring. And we'll see that at the very start of the pandemic and end of March, a small percent of districts, 5%, were offering that level of a comprehensive learning plan, and about 2/3 or 61% were doing so by May, by the end of the school year. So districts really did work to get those systems set up over the course of the spring. In the spring, we know that the majority of districts did not provide instruction. So this is now, it's a blue chart. So this is our representative sample. And so about 1/3 of districts nationally were providing some form of instruction. This is a survey coming out of Pew, and it just names that students, the gold bars, lower income students faced more challenges and had fewer resources in order to access remote learning. And so about 1/3 to 1/2 of those students surveyed named some pretty significant barriers to learning in the spring. Also, out of a RAND survey, the teachers surveyed in the April-May time period named that they received significantly less support for students with supporting students with severe disabilities, students experiencing homelessness, and English language learners, though they did receive general supports. Moving into this fall, what we saw, and if you look at this dark green bar, you'll see that in July, on July 15, most districts actually plan to go back in person. The dark green bar is remote. However, within a month, by August 20th, the vast majority of districts had shifted gears and chosen to go back into remote mode. And a lot of that, as you may recall and have lived through, was due to changing virus rates and recommendations across the country. Interestingly, when we looked at our representative sample, which is more representative, again, of the country, we saw that, again, look for the dark bar here because that is what's remote. We saw that city-based districts were very likely to be remote, but suburban and rural were far more likely to be in person. And since the spring, we've seen some real improvements. One big one is just that there's a great deal more instruction. So we went from, this is in our 100 district urban sample, 21% of districts providing instruction in the spring to almost all of them providing instruction in some form this fall. We also saw a lot more clarity on attendance and grading expectations. And we saw general commitment to serving students with special needs and English language learners articulated. However, what we haven't seen quite as much is districts explaining what their strategies are for catching up students who may be behind or who fit into other categories of marginalized or vulnerable learners. So you can see here that less than 50% of the districts we reviewed there are expecting or creating universal expectations for student diagnostics, providing interventions, supporting students with college and career work, et cetera. This is another external survey about parents' regard for the need to address racial inequity in districts. If you look again at the gold bars, which represent parents of color, you'll see that they vastly, well over 50% in every single category, preference the need for districts to be naming and addressing racial inequities in their districts in order to, or in their schools, to feel comfortable to send their students back to school. We just did not see as much on the district side. About 20% of districts actually named racial equity as a clear priority with intention behind it for what they would be changing to address racial inequities in the district. So that felt a little out of sync. Also, we noticed that districts were not communicating a lot of information about what summer or fall professional development and supports to teachers look like. This could be that they're just not communicating it out broadly, but generally, most districts were not sharing a lot of detail on whether or not they're increasing professional development time or providing remote coaching for teachers as they headed into remote learning and new conditions. And we'll be touching on this one slide, I think, quite a bit in our panel. We just saw a pretty wide difference across how states approach this. Every state has its own context and circumstances. What we generally saw was that states tended to take on a recommendation role. And all states addressed this question of how to support remote learning and how to prepare for multiple remote learning scenarios. A smaller number of states actually made requirements of the districts to actually do certain things to meet expectations in that preparation. And I think we've seen some other articles coming out on this. We ran our national representative sample, so about 500 districts, and we looked for districts. These green dots are the districts in our sample who opened despite being in districts or states whose health conditions advised against reopening. And in the same turn, these red dots represent districts who didn't open in person, and they were in states where they were under the health threshold. So it did feel like different factors were coming into play as districts made their decisions on whether to reopen in person or remote or in a hybrid setting. These last couple of slides get at some of the most recent data. We actually just pulled some of this data last week. And so if we look at this set of slides, this tracks from September through November. Now it's the gray bars that are remote. And what you'll see is the districts are tracking, they really were working to reduce being in fully remote learning environments, and they're trying to bring in more phased in-person experiences. However, that has really halted in the month of November as virus and health conditions change. And this kind of names the obvious that health conditions really are impacting a lot of districts' decisions, and districts are keeping in mind this point that parents' own decision to choose remote schooling, if given the option, varies, and they're quite willing to take remote learning if they have to, according to this survey by EdChoice. And in fact, we know that also 1% of parents are not sending their school to in-person learning, no matter where they are. In some districts, this is a majority of their students. El Paso recently reported just 40% of their district students were in person. Broward County has reported even fewer, about a quarter of students reporting, even though they're in person. And so districts really are going to have to grapple with being in remote learning, no matter what their preference or even kind of preferred state may be. Finally, a couple other final slides here. About 80% of districts explained a plan for assessing student learning loss. And so these districts had plans to either monitor students' progress throughout the year, or to just diagnose students at the beginning of the year, or to do both. In terms of details, the most common type of diagnostics we saw were NWEA MAP and iReady. Some were using district-created assessments. Generally, districts are using a combination of formative and summative assessments, and they're most primarily focusing on English language arts and math. And some districts are communicating larger strategies, linking assessments to intervention structures, multi-tiered systems of support, MTSS structures, and actually scheduling changes. So using maybe one day a week to prioritize interventions, and to prioritize students to receive those interventions based on assessment results. In terms of interventions for students, about a third of districts have not shared information, but of the 2/3 that have, you'll see that they essentially are covering a range of different strategies, and kind of multiple other strategies was the most common response. Small group instruction was the most common approach taken by districts if there was just one strategy that they were using, and they seem to be doing this both virtually and in person. In terms of looking for students who are missing and looking at attendance, just 21 districts, so really only 20% of our districts studied, explain how they're trying to track down and find students who are missing. We know that almost all districts report students who they have not been able to contact or find, really, at least since the fall and sometimes since the spring. And so some really shared those strategies that they're using. By far the most frequent strategy was just some form of home contact, as you would expect. And some districts are doing multiple strategies. monitoring data, sending folks to families' homes, sending home letters, and actually trying to combine these strategies together to track down students. And so in sum, what we have found after 8 months of really studying this in depth is, and this is why we want to do this panel, to learn from some of our leaders across the country who have really been guiding this work and providing really great examples of leadership. We know that national and state leadership is crucial to creating consistent supports for all students and for the students who tend to fall through the cracks due to systemic inequities. We know that consistent leadership is important. And we also know that just devices and Wi-Fi alone does not bridge gaps. It takes a lot of other work, and it's asking a lot of districts to figure out what to prioritize right now to make everything work that they're being asked to do in remote learning. We know that parents are in just a new level of partner, and their parents and guardians are a new type of partner in their students' learning journey. They really are their students' learning guardians. And so getting parents synced up with districts to understand where their child is at, to understand what's needed to help support at the home is just more important than ever. Some of what we will be talking about here is just, what is it that's taken up to 8 months for response times for some districts when others were able to pivot within a couple of weeks? What are the systemic inequities that have been exposed through this time? And we know that districts are trying to use this as an opportunity to rebuild and reimagine themselves. What we really want to prevent is restoring an old system that was broken to begin with. And in some, I think that this idea of working to reinvent or to reimagine feels very, very important. And we talk a lot at CRPE about durable change, which is this idea of putting in place seeds that can grow within a system to right it or to actually interrupt it if needed. And so we're excited to learn from our leaders today about some of what that might look like and how to build kind of anti-fragile systems who can support all students and be flexible. And so that is a quick summary of some of the findings that we've seen. We can certainly take questions on that data, and if you're not able to download the document, let me know, and I will put our website up as well, so you can actually download any of our databases where this was pulled from. You can download, we do weekly reporting on this, so we've got scores and scores of analysis. But I'd love now to turn things over to Ashley, so we can actually hear from people on the ground doing this work, leading in the trenches every day. So Ashley, let me pass this over to you and we'll get started with our discussion.
Great, thank you, Bree, and thanks for framing this session with such a powerful array of data. And we know from tracking all of this over the last 8 months, while there's a lot of stories you can tell with data, they can't match the experiences of leaders living them on the ground, working in the trenches, trying to make all of the decisions that we've been faced with over the last 9 months or so. So we're really excited to have 3 state leaders who are in those trenches in 3 different states, working to support school systems to adapt to all the challenges presented by this pandemic. Just a quick sort of check-in on time. We're going to spend about 15 to 20 minutes in a moderated discussion, and then we'll open it up to some audience Q&A. You're welcome at any point over the course of the session to just add your questions to the chat box, and we'll be looking at that, and we'll get to your question one way or the other by the end of this session. With that, I'd love to kick us off, and Ansel, I would love to start with you. So no one was really prepared for the challenges brought by this pandemic that forced schools to close their doors, really at an unprecedented scale. And this crisis, we know, presented really extraordinary demands on districts and state leaders. When you reflect on the spring and your role as a state leader, what was the most effective way you observed state education agencies using what's really limited capacity to ensure students had access to good instruction throughout the crisis?
Thank you so much for the question, Ashley. I think it's a great question, and to me, the most important thing I think that we did in DC at the Office of the State Superintendent of Education, and that I saw other state education agencies doing, was figuring out how to stay rooted in the vision and strategy that your agency may have developed even prior to the pandemic, but figure out what that vision needed to translate to in the current moment. So I think when the pandemic really hit and everybody moved to the stay-at-home posture, there were a number of just emergency actions that we were all taking. In DC, we were focused on standing up emergency childcare for healthcare workers and other essential government employees. We were figuring out how to shift from the meals that are served every day in schools to figuring out how to deliver meals remotely, and how to ensure the proper guidance was in place for how to do that, et cetera. So at every level, state, local, education agency, and school, and families, of course, we were all just scrambling to adjust to the moment. But I think once we were able to take a minute to step back, we realized that despite all the changes that were taking place, the vision that we had laid out in our strategic plan the year before for the next 5 years, and the strategic pillars we'd laid out, still mattered and still applied. We just had to figure out what they looked like in this context. So the idea of setting high expectations, sharing and using actionable data, and building ecosystem support, those were still the right actions for our agency to be taking. It just looked a little bit different in the current moment. So setting high expectations meant thinking about how we needed to set certain foundational requirements that would apply across the board to all local education agencies, even if it felt really hard to do so, because we knew that, foundational protections for students with disabilities and English learners still needed to remain, that parents needed access to certain information and know that they could get it consistently, no matter which local education agency their child was enrolled in. But at the same time, we also needed to provide, we couldn't just set those high expectations, we also had to provide intentional supports. And again, just the kinds of supports that people needed may have shifted. So instead of focusing maybe on helping, our health and wellness team shifted away from helping districts and schools use certain types of data that they might have used in the past, to really nuts and bolts technical assistance every day around what health guidance needed to look like, and again, what serving meals needed to look like, and so on. So it was, I think, really rooting ourselves in those strategic pillars, and that just provided a foundation for our team too, to anchor their work in. And I think similarly, the local education agencies and schools we saw be able to pivot their operations, really thought about what is our instructional model, what is our vision, what is our plan, and how do we make that work in this current moment, rather than feeling like you had to sort of start from scratch on everything.
Yeah, that just seems so important. I mean, you look at this crisis and it's so easy to become reactive to every changing condition, and it is constantly changing over the course of the pandemic. To stay rooted in something that's concrete and meaningful, to ensure that reactivity just doesn't drive you all over the place. I want to, look ahead a little bit and open this up to our other folks on the panel here. Bree presented just some, I think, really important data around some of the many challenges that we're staring down over the next 6 months or more in terms of lost learning time and its implications for students and their families. And so I want to think sort of forward-looking, what are some of the strongest levers for states to really address this challenge of learning loss? And Kira, I think maybe let's start with you. I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
So on the one hand, schools probably mean more to children and families than they ever did before. Okay? From basic needs like just feeding children, to understanding the vital role that a really great teacher plays, to deeply understanding kind of the role schools play in preparing children to live lives filled with possibility. And while that is true, it is also true that for many systems across our country, and certainly for us in Louisiana, we just weren't prepared, right? When the pandemic hit, we were not prepared. And our systems, I think, were really exposed, from feeding children to device connectivity to quality virtual instruction, exposed all around. I think there were things that Louisiana was able to quickly adjust course and become sort of more responsive to, like quickly developing an empathetic and grounded plan, working with medical experts, both within government and private, to provide guidance that enable districts to inevitably act. And we I think, figured out collaboratively how to work our way through it. over the course of the last 5 or 6 months. And we are doing school in Louisiana. I think that's really important, that every family has virtual options and in-person options in every district across our state currently. And at the same time, the question of learning loss keeps me up at night. It is significant, and will be something that I think we will be grappling with in the years ahead. So things that we can do. One is I think we shouldn't get distracted by tons of silver bullets and shiny things. The same things still matter that mattered before the pandemic, right? We know that an emphasis on the instructional core was vital before. We now know, like, quality curriculum, high quality instruction, quality educators, that still matters, whether it be in person or virtual. And I think we can lose sight of that amidst our pandemic. And there are ways to incentivize that. In Louisiana, the context is such that we cannot mandate expectations for our districts around a lot of the things that we actually would like to sometimes, but we could incentivize behaviors. And there are things that we've learned a lot through ESSA funding, for example, that we can leverage the right sort of dollars to incentivize the right behaviors. In Louisiana, we already have a lot of infrastructure around this, something called the Super App, which historically, we've been able to utilize this in the context of ESSA, where we've been able to incentivize adoption and implementation of Tier 1 curriculum, strong professional support and teaching around teaching and learning, et cetera. And I think we can expect that there will likely be another round of funding related to pandemic relief. And I think thoughtful decision-making around how we incentivize the right behaviors at the level of districts is one of the strongest levers we actually have. And I think with the next round of funding, we could really include expectations around quality virtual instruction. And when we discuss quality, we're not just talking about, can a teacher deliver a lesson in front of a bunch of kids, but more specifically, how much time are children actually spending learning, right? For example, we can incentivize virtual home visits, which we actually realized that in districts that did that, they actually had stronger results long-term, way to track children who aren't showing up. So I think we have to really start to think creatively about how we incentivize the right behaviors. I think there's also a piece around lifting up bright spots where community and district partnerships have actually redone traditional swim lanes, and actually learn from those examples. So in Lafayette, Louisiana, for example, we had a local foundation who actually early on in the pandemic crisis brought together all the internet providers and asked the district to be a willing partner at the table and literally go family by family and identify where there weren't connectivity issues across the city, and actually structured a deal where the internet providers actually worked out a way to make sure that every family had access to internet at a reduced cost in partnership with the district, right? That's the kind of innovation that I think we can learn a lot from, that has the ability to impact, I think, how we get to bigger picture outcomes, like ensuring connectivity exists across all of our, for every child, across every. And then finally, I would just sort of say, I think that we do have an opportunity to expand our choice agenda, right? Parents likely have an even broader range of needs in terms of the modality of instruction that has worked for their children than they've ever had before, whether it be pods or brick and mortar, virtual, hybrid. And I think this is an opportunity for us to actually double down on choice and the connection between choice and equity, and how that actually advances our educational outcomes.
Yeah, super important points. And I really appreciate you raising the issue around, even if you can't mandate something, you can encourage it through other tools. I think, we heard a lot about local control being a barrier to action on issues related, around schooling and education during this pandemic. And I think, that creativity that you suggested is something worth remembering in light of all the challenges we're seeing. David, I wonder if you have additional thoughts on this question in terms of where do we go from here? And specifically, I would love to dig a little deeper into this question around the frame of local control, and think about what are some of the non-negotiables that states need to be putting into place as we look towards several more months of remote learning.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple quick maybe stats from Tennessee that might be helpful to provide a little bit of context for how we're thinking about this. So in Tennessee right now, 2021 school year enrollment declined about 33,000 students in Tennessee. Our estimate is that more than 80% of students in the state are receiving less in-person instruction days in typical school year, at least through October. And I don't want to lose sort of sight of not only does this K-12 matter in this conversation, but there's like sort of really secondary aspects of this conversation too. And in Tennessee, first-time full-time freshman enrollment at community colleges in our state is down 19% this year and is down 35% for Black male students at community colleges in Tennessee. So with those sort of stats up front, some of the things that we hear from local communities and particularly from districts in Tennessee around the kind of things that have been helpful to them and that will be helpful to them. And some of this are some items that Kira's mentioned already as well. But I think communities and districts in particular in our state are really valuing just-in-time support, professional learning, and thought partnership that's really catered to the unique context of the districts in the state, right? I mean, Tennessee's a state that has urban districts, rural districts, suburban districts, very different needs. And so I think particularly with that incredible and diverse sort of set of needs in those districts, having just-in-time support really matters. We've also heard from districts that the ability to collaborate and learn from leaders who are outside the environment that they're working in right now really matters, whether that's from other places in Tennessee or other places across the country. I think sort of what those things tell us is that generally speaking, like one size fits all type tools are not particularly helpful, although they are well intentioned, certainly. And I think that's important to remember as you think about the supports that the districts and schools need moving forward. So with all that context, I think the way we're thinking about this is that this is both a moment from a sort of individual schools, individual districts, even post-secondary institutions to really do two things. One is to recommit to the things that actually have always mattered for kids. And I think Kira's point earlier about we know what those things are, but I would add we actually probably haven't been doing a very good job of delivering those things before the pandemic. So I think things like high quality instructional materials, good professional development for teachers, handedly just high quality in-person learning, closing the sort of digital divide. These are all things that are pretty core to what delivering good instruction looks like. And I would argue actually matter more now that we're in this this sort of moment of crisis for education than they did before. And then I think the second piece is sort of how do we reinvent? How do we think differently about where we go next and the ways in which we support schools and school districts and post-secondary institutions? And for us, we're thinking a lot about how do we use data differently? How are we actually measuring more things than we were measuring before and report out on those things publicly? How are we setting, as an example, community goals for where we want to be across the kind of T20 continuum and then hold ourselves accountable to those goals as we move students through over the next year or so? How do we think about credentials differently, stacking credentials differently? How do we think about making sure that every student has a credential opportunity when they graduate from high school? I mean, these are all sort of reimagining, reinventing things that I think actually need to be core to how we think about where we go next in the work. Yeah. So this sort of framework of recommit and reinvent is a little bit of how we're thinking about it, and that we both have to recommit to the things that have always mattered, that we candidly probably haven't been doing a great job of delivering in the first place, and then reinvent in some new areas that'll actually help build stronger and more equitable systems. The last thing I would note, just in terms of non-negotiables, is I don't want to lose sight of the question of or the sort of challenge of funding and what that looks like in the midst of a really challenging kind of economic environment as well. And so as we think about places that we need to really hold the line, I think sort of thinking about the way in which we invest in this work really matters. And I think similarly would encourage us to both think about how do we recommit, how do we make sure that education investment isn't one of the things that's just left on the side of the road as we are sort of dealing with very challenging budgets. But at the same time, how do we use this as an opportunity to kind of reinvent and make sure that the students who have the highest needs and have been perhaps historically underserved are actually the places where we're investing the most resource as well. So that's one place in particular that I would say has got to be a non-negotiable. And I think we may get into this conversation, but assessment would be another place where I think we could all argue perhaps that information is more valuable than it has ever been in terms of understanding how students are doing.
Yeah, so important, and we'll tackle that here next, I think. Before we move on, Hansel, I'd love to get your take as a leader of a state education agency just on, you hinted, David, at some roles for federal policymakers around state aid. I know there's been tremendous pressures on state education agencies in this time, and limited capacity. So when you reflect on what are like some things that federal policymakers could do to help state education agency officials address these challenges, and what are the top things that come to mind? Where should they be focusing their actions?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure that there's that it necessarily needs to come from the federal government to states. I would underscore what David said, just in terms of the broad relief that I think our country needs, and certainly our school systems need ultimately. So states are part of that, but a lot of it is the pass-through role to local education agencies and schools. I think one place is also just clarity and consistency of guidance. I think about something like, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's policy around meals, and some of the flexibility of waivers that were in place last school year that ultimately were made available for this school year as well, thankfully, that allowed for school districts and schools to continue to provide meals. But that decision came down at the very last minute. And no, I know that meant for my team a lot of scrambling to interpret some guidance that had been unclear and make sure that our schools and local education agencies could ultimately provide it. But I think it's less around sort of direct guidance from the feds to states, and more about states really taking a close look at what levers existed within their control previously and making the best possible use of those levers. So I think about something like, in DC, we had the authority to, we had an instructional time requirement, as many states do, around a number of calendar days and a number of instructional hours per day that needed to exist unless otherwise approved by the state superintendent. And we use that clause, unless otherwise approved, to require local education agencies, all LEAs across DC, to submit a standardized plan to us that covered a range of these areas that really got at the setting high expectations part of the work that we wanted to do. But it wasn't it was the first time LEAs had submitted that kind of plan to us. They understood that it was tied to that policy requirement. And they also understood, because we clearly communicated it, our goal was not to say no to anybody. We wanted to approve everybody's plans, but we wanted to see a level of detail, a level of thoughtfulness in those plans. And we also wanted to use those plans to communicate out to the community around what they could expect all of the different schools and LEAs to be doing. And so that's something that, existed within our control. The one other point I would make here about ways that states can, I think, make sure some of these requirements are in place and really help stem the tide of learning losses around partnerships that exist. Kira gave a great example of a partnership at sort of a very local grassroots level, which I think is so important. I also think at the policy level, there are really helpful partnerships. So we worked really closely with the charter authorizer in DC around making sure that charter local education agencies were just submitting one plan to both entities. The last thing we wanted to do in this moment was to, add additional burden. So we worked very closely together to create one application to streamline review across those agencies, but also to really lean on the strengths of both agencies around the kinds of supports we were providing. They can be more nimble and flexible than an SEA can, but we have broader reach and scope at times and more expertise in certain areas. We really tried to be strategic about sort of where each of us were leading and how we could coordinate our efforts to ultimately support schools.
That's such a great point. And I think one of the things that we've seen over the course of the last 9 months is more of those types of partnerships emerging and seeing just how powerful they can be when you have civic actors come together with public actors to tackle some of these really big challenges we face. I want to pivot a little bit to a question that I know is on a lot of state and local leaders' mind, which is the issue of assessments. And David, you teed this up nicely in your comments. And I think to frame this up, one of the things we saw prior to the current crisis is that state assessment systems were already at some risk of losing support from educators and parents. There was some political fracturing around those systems and some pressures that they faced prior to the pandemic. And with COVID, now these systems have really been thrown into disarray. And even as learning loss and the demands of it have really amplified the importance of knowing where students are with their learning. So David, I'd love to start with you and just get your perspective on what actions, if any, do states and federal policymakers need to take on end-of-year assessments in response to where we are right now?
Yeah, so this is a topic that I feel just a little strongly about. So I think just for sort of step back here for a second, right? I mean, we have to know how students are doing, and we need to know in a way that allows us to compare the ways in which our schools and school districts are serving students in the midst of this crisis. And obviously that is data that a lot of schools, districts, and states did not have last year. And so I think at the state level, what we would say is policymakers need to hold firm on administering an end of year assessment in the 2020-21 school year. Not having sort of an apples to apples comparison of how kids in the state are doing for 2 years, I think we believe would be incredibly damaging to students, and it would give us less insight into the equity implications of how we're serving kids in Tennessee. So if I could ask, sort of one thing of state policymakers, it would be to recommit to that implementation of a state assessment. And what we see in our own work is that parents are supportive of that. We did public polling in Tennessee in October, and something around 60% of K-12 parents were supportive of administering the state assessment. And when we took accountability off the table in that question, that number went to 70%. So I think there is an understanding among parents that that's information that we have to have in order to know how students are being served. And I certainly think that recognizing that accountability needs to change, should change. We shouldn't be thinking about shouldn't have sort of negative consequences necessarily tied to that as assessment for teachers or for students this year, given the unprecedented year. But sort of recommitting to that as a critical priority, and not only recommitting to it, but reporting out on all. And I would actually argue not even just that data, but even more data, right? Device access, mode of instruction, chronic absenteeism, all these things actually need to be publicly reported, transparently reported, even if we're removing accountability, as we should, accountability implications for this next school year. So that's how we're thinking about it at the state level. At the federal level, I think continuing to require that would be great. And I didn't think that I would maybe be saying this, but I agree with the comments of Senator Murray this week, and saying that we need to continue to administer those state assessments. And so I think just that continued approach from policymakers at the federal level would be great.
That's great. And maybe under your theme of recommit and reinvent, Kira, I want to follow up with you and think about how can states use this moment to rethink assessment so that they ultimately emerge from this crisis being more relevant to some of the core stakeholders in education, but also with a stronger basis of political support, which was weakened over the last 10 years of reform.
Yeah. Well, first things first, I want to start by saying, David, as a state policy leader in Louisiana, we're grappling. I accept your invitation to really stay the course. I couldn't agree with you more. Never before have we needed some type of tool or a suite of tools that help us really understand where kids are for the purpose of getting them where they need to go. That feels incredibly important. And in Louisiana, we know that we have already been sitting close to the bottom. And now we know that our children have missed 1 or sometimes even longer, 2 years worth of instruction. So assessments have never really mattered more. And I'm grappling with this. Bree and I have been on other calls recently. CRPE's been an incredible partner and helping me sort of as a policy leader sort of think about the ways that we might begin to reimagine. We know that state testing in our state cannot be more than 2% of time. So this is really our chance to reconsider the quality of that 2%. And everything David said, I would co-sign on. The one thing I would maybe sort of emphasize even more is, again, I think that the political, the thing that we haven't fully capitalized on is the fact that families want to know, parents want to know how their children are doing. I hear that every day in my community amongst my constituency, right? And I've now gone through this. This will be our third major accountability or sort of assessment rethinking over the past decade, right? On the state board that I've, sat on for the last decade. And really that voice, the family voice, what parents prioritize, what they care about, has always been the most minimal. I hear the most from special interest. I hear a lot about like specific measures people care about, and we start to have fights over, should it be 15% growth or should it be 30%? Like we get into the nitty gritty very quickly. But the fact is, I think we have a huge opportunity to figure out how do we re-engage families and really find out what they care about and ensure that we are assessing across a broader suite of dimensions what is really valuable. And I believe that now we have an opportunity, given how families have spent the last 6 months, to do it, given where the energy is. And I think that could shift some of the political tide around some of the third rails around this issue.
Such an important point. And I think, one of the things that has become increasingly apparent through this pandemic is that parents are more engaged than they ever have been, because as the recent op-ed that Baltimore superintendent, as he said, you can't hide from it when it's in your home. So it's right there up close and personal. And it seems like there's a real moment to bridge connections and leverage that voice. I want to start opening up to some audience Q&A. You can use the room chat or the questions. So if you have things on your mind that you would like to ask these three state leaders, or if there are questions that came up through Bree's presentation of some of the data that we've been exploring over the last 9 months, this would be a great time to shoot it over in the chat, and we'll start working through some of those questions. I'm not seeing any at the moment, so as you think about that, I'll toss out one more question to our group of panelists, but please feel free to start adding those questions to the chat and we can dig in. Sort of under this theme of reinvent, would love to sort of think a little more forward-looking and consider, what are some of the opportunities that states have, not just to inform like a recovery process where we rebuild the systems as they existed prior to the pandemic, but really rebuild in a way that's more just and more equitable. And I'm thinking here about, some of the highest leverage areas that are sort of ripe for this, and want to hear from you all what's on your mind. Hansel, why don't we start with you? And just what have you been thinking about on this front?
Yeah, I think it's such a good question, and I have two thoughts here. I think one, so the macro thought is just, I think it's just going to be so important to create space and reflection time to think about these lessons learned holistically across communities, to think about not just reverting automatically back to what we had before just because we can, but really thinking about, are there changes that we want to carry forward? And I think about those on both a tactical level and a strategic level. So an example of a tactical change would be, we have seen all of our local education agencies in DC have really detailed and specific approaches to how they've thought about student discipline in the context of remote learning. So thinking about when a disciplinary action has to be taken, they generally did not stop all teaching and learning from happening. They may have asked a student to not participate in synchronous group learning in the same way, but they found asynchronous or independent ways for that student to still have access to instruction in some way. What will that mean for out-of-school suspensions in the future? It might mean that instead of simply sending a student out of the building, there's been such a debate around exclusionary learning, and now we can talk not only about how a disciplinary action is applied or not applied, but maybe that an out-of-school suspension should not look the same way anymore, that a student should have access to learning no matter what has precipitated, that there's a way to sort of reinforce expectations without sort of taking away the access to learning. And so how can we learn from those actions? So that's a tactical example. At a strategic level, I just want to underscore something that Kira said, where I think that this connection between families and schools, this tighter connection between families and schools, is something that we really need to leverage and build on and think about in a different way. I think not only, it's just tightened that connection so much more. It's demystified for families what their children were experiencing all day in a school building. They have much more direct exposure to it now. And so I think that could play out in a lot of different ways, but I think just to tie it back to the conversation around assessment and accountability, prior to the pandemic in DC, when we went through our ESSA plan and launched a new DC school report card in December 2018, we had engaged with 4,000 voices of families and community members in the design of that report card. And as Kira said, it was a really eye-opening moment to hear directly from family members about the things that mattered to them the most. One of the things we learned was one of the things families cared about the most were what were schools' approaches to family engagement. How are schools communicating with families? And that went from being something we had sort of buried on the last page of the report to something we made really prominent as part of the school profile, and committed to thinking through what other information points could we start to bring in future years about how schools do engage with families too. And we would never have heard that without that kind of family engagement. But what we also learned was that it took real investment and planning from our end at the state level. We could not have gathered that much input if we were trying to do it on our own. That's not natural for state education agencies to do. What it required was that we work really thoughtfully with community partners who already had their own networks of family members with whom they had trusting relationships, to really think through. We would bring them a set of something we wanted to get feedback on that we thought we'd worked on to make very plain language, very simple, very accessible for families. And they'd say, go try again. You need to push it through 3 more times. You think it doesn't have jargon in it, but it definitely does. Or you think you're asking this in a way that a family member will care about. It does not yet. You need to rethink this more. And that push of our community partners helped us make our questions so much more actionable and accessible for our families. And it also held us accountable to actually making changes based on the feedback that we heard, and gave families a way to understand the changes we made and made them more willing to engage with us further along in the process. But that's not easy to do. And so it takes real investment and support from the state to see the value of that, to put the time and effort into planning in that way, to building the relationships with community partners who can help us do that. And I think it is that kind of thinking that we will need to do to really get the strategic value out of that closer tie between families and schools.
Yeah, it seems so important. And I think your example of leveraging community-based partners seems like a key lesson that we can take from here around how to engage families. I mean, I've seen those surveys come through, the state education agency trying to gather feedback, but the number of people who ultimately engage in those is much smaller than the people involved. That seems like a key lesson. Kira? I know you've been thinking about
I love this question. I'll boil it down quickly to just 2 things, because I know we're coming to the end. One, I want to revisit this idea of devices and connectivity for every child, because ultimately that is an issue of equity, and the fact that wasn't in place had huge implications for so many families and created such divide. And I don't mean just devices in homes necessarily, but I mean connectivity wherever children are, so that children can learn wherever they are. Community centers, libraries, that there can be places of learning everywhere. And that's about the partnerships, again, between our public institutions and our private and civic communities, right? And I just think that should continue to be a major focus of what should be true in every community across this country. It's hard to disentangle the impact of the pandemic from this moment that our country is facing around racial reckoning, and the sort of hopefully reimagination that our country is going through now. It certainly has, I think, opened a really long overdue conversation, at least in my state, which historically has not prioritized this conversation around culturally relevant curriculum, standards. How do we ensure that the material we are putting in front of our children is culturally relevant? How do we ensure that our standards, whether it be our social studies standards to be most obvious, are actually telling the truth about our history and the diverse range of elements of our history to our children, and assessing, and sort of adequately capturing all the elements that are a part of that. So I would just sort of name that. And finally, I'm biased. I've spent my life in thinking about leadership and thinking about talent, but it isn't lost on me that this was also a moment of sort of re-examining the vital role of leadership within government, because we just saw such ranges of response based on the quality of leadership at every level of our system. And so I just think there's the optimist in me believes that this is a moment where we have the opportunity to sort of reignite and re-energize a new generation of leaders to consider going into government, to consider sort of building careers in government to lead through these types of crises. And I think that's a really important aspect of what to consider for the future.
Yeah, so important. I think the leadership angle, it resonates with me a lot from watching states and the actions over the last 9 months or so. David, what's on your mind?
Yeah, so I'm going to take a bit of a different direction and actually kind of move us up the continuum for kids and talk for just a minute about this kind of 12th grade into what comes after intersection, and just kind of reiterate this data point that I shared at the beginning, because I think it's just so striking, right? Which is that first time full-time freshman enrollment at community colleges in Tennessee is down 35% for Black male students. And so for me, the question, as I think about places where reinvention coming out of this, a new way of doing things coming out of this is most exciting, is thinking about what happens between 12th grade and in some ways almost 12th grade sort of graduation from high school, and what happens maybe 1 or 2 semesters into the post-secondary experience. And that a lot of that requires community colleges thinking very differently about what they do. It requires building up infrastructure around how to use data and target students in different ways. It requires us to think differently about non-tuition financial supports and how are we making sure that students aren't having to leave post-secondary institutions because of an economic downturn. It has a lot to do with thinking about advising, which is both there's a sort of a high school piece of that, but there's also sort of a bridge piece of that, and then what happens in the first semester to into post-secondary institutions. But sort of rethinking what happens from sort of 12th grade into the first 2 semesters or so of post-secondary, and particularly at the kind of community college and technical school perspective. I just think that's a huge need. This crisis and economic downturn have exacerbated that need in really significant ways. And rethinking what the kind of community college role is in that, and the way that community colleges lead on that transition, to me is exciting. And I think places that get that right will have much stronger transition students into post-secondary education than they had prior to the pandemic.
Yeah, such an important issue. Well, I think we're just about out of time, and this has been such a great conversation. I have a few takeaways that I'll sort of offer up in summary to this conversation. One thing I heard is sort of like this back to basics, not in the traditional sense, but in the sense that there's some foundational things that have always mattered, and they still really matter, and let's not lose sight of that and pursue the latest new intervention to address, the challenges we're facing now. We actually have some basic tools to act on things like learning loss, and how can we support action on those is sort of the question. Another thing I heard from all of you is that we really need to get creative around how we get there. How do we address needs in districts? It's not just about mandates or local control, sort of that black-white thinking that we often hear in issues around state policymaking, that there's a needle to thread around incentives, around supporting creative partnerships at the local level that can really result in some tangible progress on some of these issues that we care about. A third theme that I just want to amplify is this opportunity to better engage families and community-based partners in the work of state policymaking. This just feels like such a big gap. And it sort of has multiple purposes. One is that these partners can help states do their work more effectively. And another is that they can provide sort of help shore up the political basis for many of the reform initiatives that could become important in the next several years. The final theme, which I think has been on a lot of our minds, is just that this is an opportunity, as Bree sort of teed up at the beginning, to really reinvent and build something better, not just restore what has always existed. And that all of these things that we've talked about really, I think, go towards that end. So I want to take a moment and just thank everyone for joining us today, and especially our panelists, Kira, David, and Hansel. It's been so lovely talking with you. It's a very different format from doing an in-person moderated session, but it was very fun nonetheless. And I want to thank Bree for taking the time to share all the data that she's been collecting over the last 9 months. And with that, I think we will close up shop. So thanks again, everyone. Really appreciate your time. And please feel free to follow up with either Bree or I if you have any questions that come up out of this session.